Hello, I'm Snape from Liverpool University, and today I'm going to be talking about a really important topic within the study of Egyptology, which is the nature of the private tomb from Dynastic Egypt. It's one of the things that everybody knows about ancient Egypt, of course, that the Egyptians put a lot of effort into creating tombs for themselves and filling those tombs with objects that they would need for the afterlife. But what many people don't appreciate is the particular belief systems that the Egyptians developed, which gave rise to this particular approach to the tomb, and the way that the tomb itself changed and developed over time into something that became quite a sophisticated machine for gaining the afterlife. Now, our starting point is the tomb that we see on the screen at the moment, which is tomb 1845, which was excavated by Petrie at the site of Tarkhan. Tarkhan is in Lower Egypt, not far away from Memphis, and before the foundation of Memphis, it seems to be the cemetery of quite an important settlement in the region. Because of this, its cemetery is large and contains some of the best tombs of this period. After the foundation of Memphis, Tarkhan became less important, but its cemetery still remains an important site for the understanding of the development of tombs at the unification period itself. So we're talking about 3100 3000 BC, at the boundary between Dynasty 0 and Dynasty 1. Tomb 1845 is particularly important because it comes from exactly this period, the transition into the unification period. And as a tomb which is undisturbed, it provides a really good snapshot of some of the beliefs that the Egyptians had about the afterlife at this period and how they were reflected in tomb design and tomb use. Now, what you're looking at here is the photograph that Petrie's team took upon the excavation of the tomb itself. And essentially you're looking at a tomb which is divided into two parts. On the left of the screen you can see that large rectangle at the bottom of which is a contracted burial. You can see the skeleton at the bottom, surrounded by a few grave goods. To the right, on the outside of the tomb itself proper, you can see great piles of pottery which have been left against the outside wall of the tomb. Both these parts of the tomb, the inside with the body in the grave and the outside bit of the tomb, are crucial aspects of what will become the bipartite tomb, the tomb in two parts, which typifies private tombs from ancient Egypt of all periods. And it's because of this tomb is an early example of a tomb type which will become standard for most of dynastic Egypt that it's such an important starting point to understand how tombs developed. If we have a look at Petrie's plan of the tomb, his little sketch, we can see this bipartite aspect a little more clearly. So once again on the left, you can see this rectangular mud brick enclosure which stood above ground level, and within it a grave dug below ground level which contains the body, which as you can see once again is in this contracted pose, taking relatively little room within the grave, surrounded by a few grave goods. Now, it has to be admitted at this point, we don't really know why the body is in this contracted position. There are a number of theories about this. Is it that the body is being shown in a fetal position because it's returning to the great cosmic void in the way that it came into life? That's a possibility. Is it because the people digging the grave wanted to use as little effort as possible and so created a shallow grave and had to contract the body to fit within it? Or is it for other reasons which are simply lost to us? To be honest, we don't know. So this bit of the expectations of the afterlife, the reason for the position of the body, is a little bit unclear. Similarly, the direction in which the body faces is also a subject of some controversy. In some cemeteries, the face of the skeleton looks towards the east, and some people think that this is looking in the direction of the rising sun, symbolising rebirth. In other cemeteries, the body faces in other directions, for instance to the west, and here you could perhaps link it with the idea of the setting sun, and the land of the dead, as the West became in later belief. But once again, this is largely supposition. The Egyptians don't leave us from this period any written records or any clear evidence which allows us to put body position into any greater religious theological context. But perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about this at this stage, because there's something much more important going on, and that's what's going on the outside of the tomb. Again, to the right, we can see Petrie's sketch of the pottery which has been piled up against the outside wall of the tomb. But the tomb isn't just the rectangle, or rather the exterior of the tomb isn't just this rectangle of mud brick, this very standard form which will later become known, which archaeologists know as a mastaba, because it looks like the bench or mastaba which is outside many Egyptian village houses. There's something else going on as well, and you can see that in the upper part of this image, on the outside of the tomb, there's another little mud brick extension. The solid black here represents mud brick walls, and it's a little room, or rather it's more like a little storage area. If you compare it, the size of this room to the size of the skeleton, clearly it's not something that a living human being could walk into and move around. It's just a little area which contains, as you can see, in this case drawings, but in reality a few small pieces of offering pottery. On the outside, in the lower part on the right of the drawing, are these large storage vessels. Now, what does this mean? Again, there are a number of theories. One could argue that this is a funeral meal which takes place at the tomb at the time of the funeral itself. And certainly we have some evidence that similar meals were consumed at the time of burial. But if it was just for a funeral meal, you wouldn't have this little room tacked onto the outside. So there's something else going on. And based on later developments in tomb design and the later good evidence we have from texts which come from later tombs, we can be reasonably certain what this is. That little room is in fact something which becomes in later tombs an offering chapel, where things are left for the benefit of the dead person within the tomb. And in fact you can see that on this particular illustration, if I move the arrow, you can see that there's a pair of connecting holes which are between the offering chapel and the main body of the tomb itself. There's one here and there's one here. And again you can see by comparison with the size of the skeleton, these are far, far too small for any human being to pass through, but they represent little channels of which something less substantial can pass through. So what is that less substantial thing? To answer this, we need to understand the nature of the soul. For the ancient Egyptians, the survival of the personality after death took different forms, and the history of Egyptian funeral belief is the evolution of these different types of soul or personality or spiritual form, whatever you want to call it, which survived after death. At this period, at the unification period, and throughout the Old Kingdom, by far and away the most important aspect of the soul or personality which survived after death for a non-royal individual, and by non-royal I mean anyone who isn't the king, was the ka. The ka is an aspect of your personality which survives after the death of the body. But the Egyptians thought of the ka in a very specific way. They didn't think of it going to an afterlife which was beyond this world. They didn't yet think of an Egyptian heaven which ordinary people could enter, although there clearly was a form of heaven or afterlife which the king could go to. Instead, the ka was limited to the tomb, so that they thought of the ka as having some of the limitations of a living human being. For instance, the ka needs a physical host, something in which it can live, and that is the body. This is why the Egyptians developed such an interest in the preservation of the body, not for itself, but as a host, as a place that the ka could live. The ka needed other things as well. Rather oddly, perhaps, that we might think, it needed food and drink. And it needed food and drink on a regular basis, because it didn't want to go hungry or thirsty within the tomb. So that the tomb, although we see some developments of the tomb as a great storeroom, and some of the great elite tombs that we see at the unification period at Saqqara have this massive storeroom aspect to them, the Egyptians quickly realised that you couldn't store enough food for eternity. And so the idea that food and drink would be brought to the tomb on a regular basis by the living becomes an important idea. And in Tarkhan tomb 1845, we can see the development of these ideas. That the tomb becomes a place where the body is kept safe and secure. And that's the element on the left. That's the mastaba with the grave within it. People aren't intended to access this bit of the tomb. This is where the body is kept safe. But the other bit, the offering chapel, is a place where the living are very much encouraged to visit, because they're encouraged to come and leave offerings, particularly food and drink offerings for the dead person, or rather the car of the dead person within the tomb. So that's why we see these two little connecting holes between the main part of the tomb, which we can perhaps call the burial chamber, and the little bit on the outside, the offering chapel. The holes allow the car to pass from the burial chamber into the offering chapel and consume the food that's left there. Of course, the Egyptians don't think of the consumption of the food as being a physical disappearance of the food. They would perhaps be quite disappointed if they expected that to happen. But instead, the car, being a spiritual entity, seems to be able to take advantage of the, spiritual aspects of the tomb to consume what it needed and then re-enter the burial chamber and re-dwell within the body itself. What would happen to the food left in the offering chapel we'll come to a little bit later. So at Tarkhan, right at the beginning of the dynastic period, we see this bipartite aspect of the tomb, a tomb which is thought of as two elements. Archaeologically, we can follow this by looking at tomb design right the way throughout the dynastic period, and we could use lots of different examples. I don't want to go through lots of examples at this point. It would just be re-emphasising that basic simple point. But I'll just show you a couple which I think are particularly instructive. This illustration is a drawing which comes from the Book of the Dead, a book of funerary literature, which belongs to a man called Nebked, who lived in the New Kingdom. This little drawing, which is effectively a cross-section of his tomb, illustrates this bipartite aspect very clearly indeed, so that on the top left, actually what we can see is the funeral of Nebked himself. He's the body, or rather the coffin, in front of the offering chapel. This building with the open door that we can see here is that offering chapel. This is the place where the living would be expected to visit. But then you've got this deep shaft, and at the bottom of which you've got the burial chamber, or rather a series of burial chambers which contain objects within them, including, most importantly, the body itself lying here on a funeral bed. So that this illustration emphasises the point that we've made, that the Egyptians thought of the tomb as being in two parts, in two elements. But they also began to think of the tomb in other ways as well. The way that they referred to the tomb, the most common word for tombs, is to think of it as the house of the car. And as we've already seen, the idea that the car is based on a real human being with a real human's needs, it's only a short step to think of the tomb as being the house in which the car is the householder. What we've got here is a good example of that idea in action. This is the Middle Kingdom site of Beni Hassan, and we can see a row of tombs here which look, for all the world, like a row of doors to houses. And that's the way that they were thought of, that these were indeed tombs which were designed like houses and have lots of design features, like doorways, like carvings which represent the wooden beams of real houses, which allow tombs to have an aspect which makes them much more house-like. And this is part of a wider connection, I suppose, between the world of the living and the world of the dead. We've already got a connection in that the car is thought of as being a bit like a living person living within the tomb. We've already mentioned that the dead, the cars within the tombs, need things from the living. They need the living to come along and make offerings at the tombs. And the way that cemeteries are such an important aspect of towns, here for instance at Beni Hassan, the cemetery is high up in the cliffs, overlooking the floodplain where the living dwell, and would be very visible to the living during their working days, gives a connection between the living and the dead, the tomb and the house, the cemetery and the town, which is actually quite profound and represents part of a greater community of Egyptian towns which represent or include both the living and the dead. This idea that the tomb is a place where the dead are provisioned, that they're provided with food and drink, is one which can only get stronger and stronger as a dynastic period progresses, especially during the Old Kingdom, and particularly among people who could afford the largest and most elaborate of tombs. Essentially what I'm talking about here are owners of the great elite tombs of the Old Kingdom at places like Saqqara, Giza, Abu Sir, and so on. Here, the offering chapel becomes larger and larger, and it becomes decorated. The walls of these offering chapels, often made out of fine quality limestone, carry images which stress this idea, which connect the tomb to the idea of the house and as a place where the living will bring offerings. This is just a little illustration of one of these scenes from the Old Kingdom. This is from a stela, a stone slab in the British Museum, which shows the tomb owner and the diminutive figure, the tiny little figure on the right here, which belongs to a servant who is bringing a drink for the tomb owner. Obviously the scale here isn't realistic, but the idea sums up the idea of the tomb owner waiting to be provided with food and drink by the living who are acting as his, or in other cases her, servants. The design of the tombs, especially those which are made out of stone and have these texts and illustrations, further emphasise this idea of the tomb as a place of provisioning, a place where the dead are fed. This, the thing you're looking at here, is an absolutely classic image. If you like, this is the core central image of Old Kingdom tombs. Even when the tombs in the best cases are very large, they have many rooms, they have lots of scenes of daily life within them, this scene is the most important. It shows the tomb owner, in this case it's a woman, a lady called Waj Kawes, it comes from Saqqara, sitting down in front of a great table which is full of slices of bread, and above the hieroglyphs refer to bread and beer and vegetables and beef, things for her to eat and drink in the afterlife. But this scene comes from an element of the tomb which becomes very common in the Old Kingdom, the so-called false door. This feature essentially takes over from that earlier simple Tarkan hole-in-the-wall arrangement which connected the burial chamber to the offering chapel. Here we've got something much more substantial. It's called a door because its form is closely modelled on that of a real door. It's a false door because, in this case, it's a solid slab of limestone. A real person can't cross through it into the tomb beyond. But the false door is in a way misleading because something could pass through it, of course, which is the car. The car, being a spiritual form, can cross through the stone doorway because it's carved like a doorway. Presumably it gives it that spiritual power to be an access point into the tomb for the car, and this becomes then the point where the offering chapel meets the burial chamber, and also it becomes a place which is a clear sign for the living who are bringing food offerings that this is the place that they should be left. So in the Old Kingdom, and indeed in some tombs of later periods, the false door becomes the focus of the offering chapel as a place where the living can leave food for the dead. Images within the tombs emphasise this idea, and the idea that the tomb owner is shown receiving offerings of different types, food and drink, but also things like incense, become very common. So for instance, on this image, which comes from another tomb at Saqqara of the Old Kingdom, on the left you see the tomb owner standing, striding, holding a sceptre and a staff in his hand. In front of him, below knee height and at knee level, you see a tiny figure which is blown up on the right. This man is identified as a car priest, or rather an overseer of car priests. This is a man whose responsibility is to make sure that offerings are made to the dead person within the tomb. Effectively, it becomes a profession. And the way that this works, the way that offerings are organised to be made to the tomb, becomes quite a complicated and complex industry. The way that it seems to work is that the tomb owner, before he dies, essentially leaves economic resources in his will which will serve the tomb. So typically this will be a bit of agricultural land. The produce from that land, let's say grain to turn into bread or beer, or a vineyard to turn into wine, or a pasture on which animals can live and then be turned into joints of beef, that agricultural land and what it produces belongs to the tomb. The food that's produced by that land can serve as the offerings to the tomb. And the car priests, or more accurately, the servants of the car, are the living who bring the food to the tomb. But why should they do this? Well, being family obligation is one way. Quite a lot of these car priests are relatives of the dead. A social obligation is another way of this being an important thing to do, because of course if you keep the system going while you're alive, then the hope is that other people will feel obliged to do it for you when you are dead. But the economic obligation or the economic benefit is perhaps the greatest, because what happens, the way that it works, is that the car priests who bring the offerings to the tomb, they leave those offerings in the way that we mentioned before at Tarkan. But remember, the car only extracts perhaps the spiritual essence of the food. There are no burnt offerings here. The food is not destroyed in any way. In fact, after the car has finished with it, and presumably the car priest can tell when that's happened, the food, untouched, at least physically untouched, can be taken away and can act as the payment for the car priest. So what we have in tombs of the Old Kingdom, what we see developing from a tomb like Tarkan 1845, is the development of a whole system. It starts with an idea of what the dead will expect. What they expect is that the car will be fed for eternity. We then have an architectural context in which this takes place, so that the tomb develops in its own particular way to both protect the body and to provide a place where the living will come and leave offerings for the dead. And it also involves a social and economic system, that the people who are bringing the food offerings to the dead, who are leaving them in the appropriate place within the tomb, have both a social obligation, a societal obligation, and yet also economic benefits for doing so. And so what the Egyptians set up at the beginning of the dynastic period is a whole system based on beliefs in the afterlife, the creation of physical structures, and an interaction between the living and the dead, which will benefit everybody, both living and dead. And again, we can think once again of Egyptian communities and buildings within those communities as constituting both the living and the dead, and that idea of community, of being the living and the dead, and of course the gods who dwell within Egypt, are part of the way that the Egyptians visualised the world in which they lived, the people who lived within it, and their own particular needs, whether they were living or whether they were dead.